Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for helping us get the word out about the podcast. If you appreciate hearing these current topics being talked about from a biblical perspective, make sure that you share the podcast with a friend and encourage them even to go to jimrichmond.net. And when the pop-up comes up on the homepage there to sign up for the Worldview email list, certainly they can also sign up for the church leadership or the parenting list as well. Also, check out my books on Amazon. Christ and Culture covers all of the hot topics in our culture from a biblical perspective. And then I've also got 2 parenting books out, Use It or Lose It, Parenting for Long-Term Results, and Discipline That Disciples. And right now I'm actually working on a book about all the topics that couples need to talk about before they get married. So be watching for that. Could be a good wedding gift. Today I want to hit a topic that is a major issue in our culture right now. How we think about this issue will either destroy our culture or create a culture where people can really, really flourish. So I want to dive into this idea of free speech and kind of freedom in general. Is it a biblical concept? So today, a lot of Christians would kind of say, well, we shouldn't talk about our freedoms, right? Jesus laid down his rights, so we shouldn't worry about ours. But I think Christians can and should be concerned about freedoms for more than just self-serving reasons. And it kind of feels like that there's this push out into the Christian community on purpose to kind of get Christians to stop worrying about the concept of freedom. One of the thoughts that I think about when I think about that, and this is a little bit off topic, is just this concept of how often we look back to the Holocaust and we think, where were the Christians? Right? I mean, the limiting of freedoms wasn't about them, right? So, they should have spoken up, but they didn't. And so I just think, are we going to get there somewhere in our own culture where as we haven't talked about freedoms, we haven't worried about freedoms, but it's not just going to be our freedoms, it's going to be somebody else's freedoms as well in the future, and it's going to be horrific, and we're going to say, wow, why didn't we speak up when this was a much smaller issue? As Christians, we think about these issues more than just what our country's laws say, right? Like the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech, but we want to know, is it a Christian value, right? And if so, are there any limits on it? And so that's how we come at this thing. And so first of all, let's just see, is this a biblical value at all? And I think when we begin to approach this issue biblically, we have to start with God's overall view of freedom, okay? God created the world. He placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and he chose to give them freedom to decide if they would follow him and obey him or choose a different way. He placed the option of choosing something that was wrong right there in their perfect environment. And then when Satan came on the scene, he allowed Satan to tell his side of the story. Why? Why would he allow that? Because God wanted their love for him to be genuine and not forced. Even though he had created all these universes and this perfect environment for them, and he deserved to be completely obeyed and worshiped, no questions asked, he didn't want them to be forced to agree with him and to love him. So this concept of freedom, to choose, is extremely important, I think, to God. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't consequences, obviously, for choosing wrongly, right? We're still experiencing the consequences of Adam and Eve's decision. But that principle, I think, is still there, that God allowed freedom. And I think this principle translates to freedom of speech. God would be for freedom of speech. If he allowed Adam and Eve to disobey him, he certainly would not think that a human ruler has the right to demand that no one can disagree with him, right? So let's take a look at a few passages along the way here. First of all, I just want to start with Romans 1:18. Here's what it says: "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." Isn't that interesting? He talks about people who are godless and wicked, and what are they doing? They're suppressing the truth. So God is not a fan of people who want to suppress truth. Does God think that there should be any kind of limits on speech? And if so, like, are those self-regulated, or is he okay with those being government-regulated? Well, let's take a look at that and think about that for a second. In the Old Testament, God says to Israel that blasphemy against him should be punishable by death. He also says in Deuteronomy 19:16 through 19 that a person who lies in a court case should receive the same punishment that the person he lied about would have gotten if they were actually guilty. So that's a couple of laws in the Old Testament that God says if you cross over this, there should be civil penalties for the violations of the way that you talk, the way that you slandered somebody, or the way that you blasphemed God. Now, those are both civil laws that God gave to Israel. We've talked about that, right? How to understand the Old Testament. And so I think those punishments necessarily are not required of all nations in all times. Israel was basically a theocracy. However, it does show that there are limits to what a government will allow when it comes to speech. And it's okay that there are some limits as far as what a government will allow when it comes to speech. And so through the years, our Supreme Court has made a few exceptions to free speech that can lead to being held accountable by the government. And those are things like incitement, obscenity, defamation, libel, fraud, fighting words, true threats, and speech that's integral to criminal conduct. So, those are pretty reasonable exceptions, right? Freedom has to be guided by some kind of standards. Freedom is not the ability to do anything you want to do. That is the definition that our culture operates by now, and that's not a correct definition of freedom. But it's really freedom to do what you ought to do. And so if you're threatening people's lives, you're planning a crime, you're destroying people's reputation with false information, you're encouraging other people to commit a crime, you probably should be held accountable for that. But the Bible does constantly encourage us to self-regulate our speech. Ephesians 4:29, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Galatians 5:13, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh, rather serve one another humbly in love. Colossians 4:6, let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Proverbs is full of verses about being wise in how you speak, right? And so we're supposed to self-regulate our speech. But is it absolutely essential that Christians always obey the government when it comes to speech? Well, in the book of Acts, there is an interesting scenario where the apostles are told by the government they should stop speaking in the name of Jesus. And in Acts chapter 4, 19 through 20, here's how they responded. It says, but Peter and John replied, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to listen to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. Like we can't hold it back. We can't not talk about Jesus Christ. Like you can tell us, hey, you're no longer allowed to talk about Jesus Christ, but we can't do that. So God endorses not obeying government limits on free speech when it violates what God has called us to do. When the government seeks to force certain speech or eliminate certain ideas, it's absolutely, eventually, inevitably, it's going to violate someone's conscience. And hopefully biblical conscience is what we're talking about. We're not just talking about somebody doesn't like it. So how do we find a balance between having some limits on free speech, but not becoming tyrannical and forcing people to talk or think a certain way? Well, that raises another important question. Michael Knowles, who wrote the book Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, says that this is not a battle between freedom and limiting freedom. This is a battle between traditional values and anti-traditional values. And man, like you can just see that so clearly in our culture right now. The question is not, do we tolerate everything? The question is, what do we not tolerate? The question is not, are we going to have any limits? The question is, who determines those limits? See, once we established that relativism was our standard in our culture, and we started pushing separation of church and state as this principle, which is not in the Constitution, we unhitched from Judeo-Christian values. Those two movements alone have caused us to just stop using biblical thinking because it's not allowed in our culture, right? Separation of church and state, and hey, my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. And so thus, we're now in this free-for-all over who gets to decide who gets to talk and who gets to say what. And it's based on each person's truth instead of an objective view of truth. So in the past, when we have said as a culture that in certain places obscenity is not allowed, it just made sense, right? We were a culture that thought in terms of objective truth, in terms of like there is a right and there's a wrong. But by objective Christian standard, that just made sense, right? That's language that shouldn't be used among kids. But it's not morally right if you want to do this, but if you want to talk that way at home, that was one thing. But if you're going to talk that way in public, then it's going to be regulated by the government on television and that kind of thing. So we allow freedom until it's hurting someone else, right? But now we don't have any objective standard. So we're struggling to say that lewd drag performances in public, are not acceptable. We have a hard time saying that because, like, that's your truth. That's my truth. Like separation of church and state. Your values can't come into this, can't play into this if you're a Christian. So they have the right to express themselves, right? And so it used to be that we did not allow immoral books in our schools. Now that's labeled as book banning, right? Now, there's always been book banning, right? When we operated more by Judeo-Christian values, we decided, hey, some of these books shouldn't be allowed, right? But interestingly, now there's only one book that is absolutely banned from schools, and for the most part, it is the Bible. So I don't think anyone is really for absolute speech, absolute free speech in all situations. I don't think anybody is, honestly. The question is, though, who decides what is okay and what standards is it based on? The mess that we are now in our culture is that there are no standards, except we don't want Christianity, separation of church and state. It's interesting that now that we talk about cancel culture so much, because our nation was set up largely on Christian principles, which allowed the maximum amount of free speech. So that doesn't mean that we were officially a Christian nation, but we were guided by Christian principles. Some countries like France, for instance, they set themselves up intentionally as a secular nation, that we don't want religion playing a part in any way, shape, or form. So as a nation guided by Christian principles, we set up a nation where anyone could worship however they want, anyone could express their opinions. There was a large amount of freedom and expression, right? But now it's common to see people canceled over their views, and younger generations are talking pretty seriously about whether there should even be freedom of speech. And it's interesting that people with the ungodly views kept talking about the tolerance, like it's so important that everyone should be tolerant of everything, and all the while here they're free to express their views, right? And they kept talking about tolerance while they were free to express their views because of the way that the nation was set up with Christian principles, until their views became mainstream. And now you don't hear much about tolerance anymore. Do you notice that? If you've been paying attention, if maybe you're an adult and you've been an adult for 20 years, you notice that you heard a ton about tolerance 20 years ago. You don't hear that much about it anymore. Now you hear we need to shut down the hate speech, which means anyone who disagrees with them, and we need to shut down misinformation and disinformation. They don't want a debate anymore. They don't want tolerance that, hey, all views can be talked about. Hey, all views can come to the table. They don't even want that anymore, because now their views have kind of gained a foothold in our culture, and now they just want everybody else to be shut down. Now their agenda is out in the open, and most people are starting to see the agenda and starting to hesitate, right? I don't know that we should have abortion up to birth, or lewd drag displays in front of kids. That seems wrong. Or I don't think men who think they're men should be think men who think they're women should be able to compete against biological women. And and now that people are starting to kind of push back, now that the agenda is all out there in the open, they don't want debate about what is right and true. They want it canceled. So they used to talk about tolerance. Now they talk about, hey, that needs to be canceled. That needs to be censored. Censorship is almost always pursued and pushed by those who fear the truth. Generally speaking, open debate helps people see the reasonableness of truth. One of the things that was so strange during the pandemic is just that certain views or certain thoughts about how to address the pandemic were not allowed to be released. We're not allowed to be talked about. We're shut down. We're limited in their scope on social media. Isn't that interesting? Like, why is that? Like, science should be, I think I posted sometime during that time, like, science that can't be questioned is not science. Like, that's what science is. Science is questioned, right? And then you determine, can it answer, right? And so the government really can't be trusted to determine truth. And so that's a scary thing when the government starts saying, we're going to decide what's true and what's not true. We're going to start limiting misinformation, disinformation. That's a scary thing. As Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. So unless we are fully submitted to Jesus, like, our hearts lead us astray. Our hearts lie to us. Our hearts motivate us for other reasons besides truth. Right? And so it's a scary thing to put that in the hands of a few people and say, yeah, whatever you think, that's what truth is going to be in our culture, and the rest of it's going to be shut down and can't be debated. The Bible warns about leaders being bribed, right? I mean, that's just another thing as well. Like, you're gonna like put that kind of power in the hands of people who could possibly be paid off, right? I mean, it's just crazy to think about. So here's kind of the principles we've got so far. First of all, God, who has the ultimate authority, allows freedom within limits. Isn't that something? Like, God who he has the ultimate authority and he deserves the ultimate allegiance, and yet he allows freedom. God doesn't expect Christians to follow speech restrictions that violate what God says in his word. And then giving ultimate power to control people's words to a leader or leaders can be disastrous because our human hearts lean toward wickedness and self-deceit. And then the last thing is, Christians are called to self-regulate our words and use them in a way that builds up. So we're going to have more on this right after this short break.
Want to equip your church, youth group, or Christian school with the answers they need to stand in a time of cultural decay? Contact Jim to book a Christ in Culture conference right away.
All right, well, I want to finish up today focusing a little bit more on Michael Knowles' book, Speechless. In the book, he talks about the idea that the fight over words, the words that we use, and what we call things is extremely significant, and it's an intentional tool used by the left to control people. He says that the fight over the words that we say, is really a fight over the thoughts that we think. There's been a move for some time now to redefine words in order to redirect culture and ultimately redefine reality. So speech is a huge issue right now. Confucius said this. He said, when words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom. Wow, I mean, that's a really interesting thought. When people start redefining what we obviously know things are, there usually is an agenda that involves control. So I'll say that again. When people start redefining what we obviously know things are, there's usually an agenda that involves control. In our culture, we've redefined justice, right? Justice means, what the real definition of justice is getting what you deserve without favor. That's why statues of Lady Justice show her blindfolded, right? She's impartial. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you look like. The question is, what do you deserve? But justice in our culture means making sure that everyone gets what people think they deserve based on who they are and what they look like. So it's completely different, right? It's based on, hey, this is because of who you are and what you look like, we think you deserve certain things. So when people take to the streets and they cry for justice, it sounds like something that, hey, everybody should agree with that, right? Justice is a good thing. Nobody's ever against justice, right? So that's a good thing. But what do they mean when they say that, right? They don't mean what we think they mean, right? They're creating a new standard in order to create a new reality and a new culture. We in our culture, we call abortion reproductive rights and women's health care. Who could be against women having rights? Who could be against women getting health care? Like, that just doesn't make it, a simple change in words and babies lose their right to life. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that crazy? We've changed from using the word equality, which is a biblical concept that brought about the end of slavery and discriminatory policies, and we now hear the word equity. And that's intentional. It sounds the same, right? It sounds so close, but it's so important, the difference. And who could be against things being equitable, right? But equality means everyone is treated equally under the law, and no one is held back from opportunities because of things like race, sex, nationality, religion. Everyone has the right to use their talents and skills to achieve what they can. But equity means everyone should be given the same outcome. So whether you use your talents, whether you use your gifts, whether you use your skills, it doesn't matter. You should still get what other people have, and you should have a human right to those things. Now, at that point, we're talking about socialism and ultimately communism, which are not biblical concepts, and we'll talk about that sometime on the podcast. The left does this to change how people think, thus shifting the Overton window on these matters. And this is why things that our culture would never have considered, even just a few years ago, have now become completely mainstream. Knowles talks about how the left redefines reality by assuming their own conclusion. This is so wise. This is so smart. Listen to this. For them, the question is not what is marriage. Instead, they go ahead and redefine it as a union between two people who love each other. Maybe they need to redefine it again as many people as love each other, so that they can add extra people now. But they just assume that. They just assume, oh yeah, marriage is a union between two people who love each other, right? I mean, like that's the answer. Like, you shouldn't even second guess that. And so once you assume that as the definition that everybody should be okay with, then guess what? The question as to like who has the right to get married automatically is going to go their way, right? If that's what marriage is, how can you how can you deny any two people the right to marry if they love each other? Or they start with gender and sex are not the same. They just start with that conclusion. They assume that conclusion, and then once you assume that conclusion, then if a man thinks he's a woman and gender and sex are not the same, then who's to say that he can't use the ladies' room if he thinks he's a woman? This is why what we call things and how we define words is so very important. We should ask the hard questions when we begin to see that things are being redefined. And Matt Walsh made that approach really famous with his documentary, What is a Woman? Right? He literally spent time traveling around asking people who were pushing the LGBTQ agenda, what is a woman? And it was enlightening that people were making all these assumptions without being able to actually define the word. Ultimately, free speech helps us debate what is true. Free speech is usually one of the first things that dictators seek to eliminate. Should there be laws ensuring decency and maybe a couple other exceptions? Sure. But shutting down the open debate of ideas is not a Christian concept and does not lead to freedom. Jesus famously said in John 8:32, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Now, I don't want to be accused of taking something out of context. I will say he's obviously talking about a spiritual freedom there. But the principle that truth brings freedom and the suppression of truth brings bondage is still applicable. You can't ensure that the truth will be known and it will be followed and it will bring freedom if it's censored. So that's all we've got for the show today. I'd love to hear your comments on this topic and any topics that you would like to see covered, and we will see you next Friday.